PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi.
Hello, my name is Svitlana and welcome back to the analysis of round 7 of the Women's Candidates tournament. Today, I wanted to show you an amazing game that happened between Lei Tingjie and Vaishali Rameshbabu. This game was full of wild tactics and it was the only decisive game of the round. Previously, Tingjie and Vaishali have never played against each other, so this was going to be their first matchup. Let's see how it goes. Tingjie playing as white started with e4, to which Vaishali with black replied with e5. There were no major surprises out of the opening, and we went for a very classic Italian setup. So here, white defends the pawn with d3, castles, and then after d6, just c3. Very classical Italian setup so far. Essentially, in these middle games, there's a few different plans. From white, we usually see things like h3, rook e1, knight d2, knight f1, knight g3 trying to aim for an f5 square, and also d4 at a convenient moment. From black, the plans are actually quite similar. They're also most likely going to castle, play a6, h6, maybe bishop to e6, and oftentimes also try to occupy the f4 square, for example, with the moves like knight e7, knight g6, and then knight to f4. And similarly as white, they might try to go for a d5 pawn break. So these positions are seen very, very often at high level, and they're fairly well known. So let's see how it unfolded in this game, because it was slightly different. However, these plans are very flexible and they're usually long, maneuvering middle games until tactics start happening. But in the game, Vaishali goes for a5, which is a bit of a rare line, but it still exists. It's not completely new. The idea is very similar as in a6, just to have that square for the bishop to retreat, if anything, and potentially preventing any b4s that white might want to play. So now Tingjie continues all of these main plans that I've mentioned with knight to d2 and with rook to e1. Meanwhile, Vaishali tries to exchange one of white's strong bishops, bishop to e6. Now, if the bishop was on b3 at this point, then maybe that bishop could have considered going back to c2 and avoiding that trade. And white does that a lot in these positions. But here, there's not really an option to avoid this trade if black wants to take it, so we leave the bishop there for now. So we play very typical moves h3, h6, just preventing anything on the g4 squares with the knight or with the bishop. And at this point, I've mentioned that white often wants to not trade this bishop for now, and she does decide to go for it with bishop to b5. Now, black might not want to ruin the pawn structure for now and repositions the knight onto potentially g6 and f4 later. And it is interesting that when I looked up this position, there was a game played between Nakamura and Ding at the previous candidates. But that game continued in an interesting fashion. It continued with queen to b8. And now that white took, black took, we have the open b file for the queen or the rook in the future. And that game ended in a draw there, and it's just interesting that it was played in the previous candidates, this exact line. Now, in this game though, Vaishali went with the knight, and Lei Tingjie thought it was a good moment to open things up in the center with d4. Now, here, there were a lot of games that continued from black with just the capture, and after a capture, bishop goes back to a7, and the game goes on. This would be a rather typical position and pawn structure. But in our game here, Vaishali went bishop b6, and we are now in a completely new territory. And it is interesting that in the post-game interview, Tingjie thought that this move was a bit strange, but she was worried that this might be Vaishali's preparation and that this might be theory that she doesn't know. And for this reason, she was afraid to take this free pawn on e5 because there's nothing defending it for black after the knight takes on e5. And I am not entirely sure what Vaishali's plan here was, but this looks like a solid extra pawn. Of course, Black can still try to play for some initiative with, let's say, queen to d6 or knight to g6 is probably the best move in this position. But once again, it's just an extra pawn. There's no way for Black to really gain it back, and this was completely possible for White to take. Maybe either Vaishali confused some lines, or maybe this was some sort of preparation, but I feel like it might have existed in a different line where the bishop goes to b6. So it is surprising that she doesn't take the pawn and instead goes for bishop to d3. So now Black is going to kind of try to defend this pawn with the rook on e8. So now, taking on e5 is not as good, because then the bishop is also standing on d3, then the rook is also helping on the e file. So taking the pawn is not as advantageous now, and instead Tingjie just decides to go for the regular plans with the knight to f1, the plans that she has seen before. But she will no longer have the chance to take that pawn, and now Vaishali takes it herself, defining things a little bit more in the center. White has two options of recapture. They can recapture with the pawn here, which is not what happened in the game, and the reason might be that White didn't like that Black has this forcing move with d5, and that forces White to close the position a bit more and allow the knight to invade onto e4. And for example, after something like this is this is a lot more of a typical pawn sacrifice for Black in these positions, where the bishop is strong. Black can always gain back this pawn on d4 if they want to trade on f3, and this would be a bit more typical and shouldn't be a problem for Black. Instead, she recaptures with the knight, so making not putting that pawn in the center, and now d5 is going to give White a bit more options. They will not have to necessarily close the position, and they will also be able to trade. So in the actual game, we continued with knight g6 for now, knight to g3, so just putting the knight onto their regular squares, and now bishop to d7. Perhaps she decided to avoid that knight for bishop trade, or just open up the e-file for the rook. And White here is also not sure where to put the bishop, because all of these ones are taken. Bishop e3 runs into d5, and if we decide to take, we're going to have to think about the knight capturing this bishop. So instead she goes bishop to d2. It looks weird, but there was not really any other good place for that bishop anyways. Now, Black decides to activate the knight on a really good square on e5. The bishop has to move from the attack, and now d5. Finally, we get some action in the center. White took the pawn, knight takes on d5, and the pawn structure is looking more symmetrical now, with nobody having more or less space in the center. Tingjie continued with queen to b3. Vaishali played c6, just defending the knight, and now White plays knight to e4. And I don't know about you, I find it very amusing that there's 4 knights in the center right now. It's quite a strange position. I don't think I've seen this very often in my life, just having these 4 knights there without getting attacked. But it is a bit of a strange position out of the Italian, that there's no more pawns left in the center. Now, here Black could have perhaps overtaken a bit the initiative with something like a4, and the queen doesn't have a lot of great spots. Maybe it has to try to go to a3, and after queen to h4, I feel like this could have been Black's chance to start some initiative on the king side while White's queen is stuck a bit on the queen side for now. So this might have been Black's good shot to take over the initiative, but instead she went for something a bit simpler with queen to c7, and now White decides to prevent that a4 plan with playing a4 themselves. Now the pawn structure is completely symmetrical, and it looks very calm, but soon we will get to the exciting tactics. Black brings the rook to the d-file, White brings their rook, and now every single piece is developed, standing on a relatively good position, but now they both have to try to figure out what to do, how else to improve, which weaknesses to even attack, because this looks so symmetrical. Basically, the only difference is the queen and the bishop from both sides, which is a very funny position to have. And Vaishali now wanted to change a bit, improve at least one of the pieces, and she goes knight to g6, perhaps trying to play with the knight to f4. And it was possible to do other things, for example, define the pawn structure in the center with bishop to d4, and after white has to recapture, we have this isolated queen-pawn type of position, but white has two bishops in return. So some advantages, some disadvantages here, probably around equal in all of these lines regardless. But she goes for knight g6 in the game, and both of them are just shuffling around for now. The bishop to c1, it wasn't doing anything useful on d2 for now, and bishop to a7. So they're both trying to figure out where their pieces even belong. This one might be trying to come to b8, making some mating threats. At this point, Tingjie starts to play a bit more for the initiative. She goes for c4, wants to define the knight's intention and kick it away from the center. This knight could have tried to go to f4, after which white probably would have replied with c5 regardless, but maybe she didn't want the knight to be here and to be in an unclear spot when this knight also wanted to go there, and instead played knight to b4, which restricts the queen a bit more, maybe restricts this bishop. But I really like this next move from white. She plays c5, and now our pawn structure is no longer symmetrical, and white gains a lot with this move, in my eyes. First of all, the d6 square can be taken by the knight, not immediately because this pawn is attacked, but eventually this is an amazing square for the knight. And also, this pawn move really starts restricting the black bishop. It doesn't have a lot of squares, and it can no longer work well on this diagonal that it was active on the whole game. So now, because this pawn went away from c4, the knight decides to return to its best square, to the outpost on d5, after which white activates the pieces a bit more with bishop to c4. So we are going to start seeing some tactical ideas from now on. It's going to heat up a bit more from now on. At this point, it was best to play rook to e7 for black, maybe try to double the rooks on either one of the files, but white cannot take this knight in this position because the bishop has a lot of discovered threats. For example, bishop takes on a4. So it was not necessary to defend this knight, but black did it anyway with bishop to c8. So also returned the bishop back in a funny way, the same as white did a few moves ago. And now we see the next move, which was correct by Tingjie. It was bishop takes on d5. And now black cannot take back with the rook, which is a bit unpleasant, because if rook takes, there's knight to f6, a really great tactic here, winning the rook on e8 because the knight is making a check and black has to defend against it. So rook to d5 would be a huge blunder, but Vaishali doesn't go for it. She takes back with the pawn. And there is now a precise in-between move for white. Even though the knight is attacked on e4, instead we play knight to b5, which is an important move because, first of all, we're still keeping our defense on the c5 pawn, but more importantly, we're attacking both the queen and the bishop here. And Vaishali makes a logical move, defending the bishop with queen to b8, but this actually ends up being a very important mistake. Instead, she had to find queen to e5 and playing on that idea that the knight is also attacked, so that if white even takes that bishop, then we get their knight back in return. Instead, she plays queen to b8, which looks logical for now, but at this moment, there was an absolutely amazing tactic that white had. Tingjie didn't find it in the game, but you can now take this chance to find it yourself. If you want, you can stop the video and look for an amazing move here for white. So, if you're ready, let's see the variations. In the game, Tingjie played knight to a7, so this was not the move, and we're going to take a look at it, how the rest of the game unfolded. There's essentially two other options to take a look at. The most logical move, for example, would be rook takes on d5. And this is not that amazing tactic that I was talking about, but it is second best and still gives white a pretty good position. One of the issues with rook takes on d5 is that black has bishop to e6, which is all good. We don't lose the rook because we have rook to d8 capture, and after queen d8, we have to move the queen, let's say queen to c3, and bishop to d5. White is doing pretty good, but they have to make some complicated decisions with where to put the knight. For example, try to find this knight to f6 tactic once again to then capture this bishop over there. And, the game goes on. White is better, but this was not that winning tactic that just wins very confidently. So instead, I don't know how many of you found it, but I thought it was an absolutely amazing move here to play queen takes d5. So the idea here is that exact same knight to f6 plan. But if black captures our queen, which essentially they have to, I don't really see what else they can do. Let's say they try to defend the rook on d8 and play bishop h3 or bishop anywhere. Then we can simply place the knight onto d6 and just have a completely dominating position. So instead, black would have probably had to take at this point, and this would lose to knight to f6. It looks like we're sacrificing so much material. We just gave away a queen, now we also give away the knight, but there is a point to all of it, and it is that we gain back not just one rook on e8, but actually also the second rook on d5. And this is probably the hard part. It is to evaluate this position. If we just count the material, we see two rooks for white and a queen and a piece for black, which sounds like a pretty good trade for black. They should be up just based on material. But if you look at black's pieces, none of them can actually move. This bishop is tied because of the spin. This bishop also has no squares, and the queen is tied to the defense of both of them. This knight can move, but the question is where. It cannot really attack that many things from white. I'm sure it can go to e5 or h4, but white has a really serious next threat, which is rook to d8, which not only threatens this bishop, but it also is going to start threatening some checkmates. Not checkmates, but things on the king side. So it's a completely winning position for white. It's a bit hard to see at first, but if you just see this rook to d8 threat next, there's no way for black to defend against it. It's a very remarkable position and would have been insane to actually see this in the game, but let's see what happened instead. So after queen to b8, she takes on a7, and Tingjie has 14 minutes at this point to Vaishali's only 2 minutes, so I really think that if she had found that queen d5 tactic, she could have brought it home, but instead she brings the position back to equal with her knight to a7 move. And the reason why this spoils white's advantage a little bit is because you trade that beautiful knight on b5 that had so many opportunities for that bishop on a7, which was one of black's weaknesses, and a piece that wasn't doing much before. Maybe she thought that this was an improved version of the pawn capture, so now she captures on d5, but black has bishop to e6 here, so that's similar idea. And here, of course, white has to move the rook to d8 and take a rook in the process, because there was kind of a pin there, but as we saw, this rook to d8 idea makes it work. And now something really tragic happens. Vaishali is really low on time, and she instantly takes back the rook, which ends up being the losing move of the game. But I am sure that maybe 90% of us would have also taken the rook without any hesitation, but it was absolutely necessary for black to find bishop takes b3. Now, at this point, I understand that it looks a bit unpleasant to play with a queen against the two rooks, so now black doesn't have extra pieces anymore. It's just the two rooks against the queen, but this position is equal. I'm sure that it's more pleasant to play for white, but I would say that the queen will be active eventually, and black will get some counterplay for sure. Maybe even take this pawn on a4 at some point. So this one would have been equal, and this was black's best chance of the game, but instead she instantly takes the rook, which looks so natural and what most people would play without even considering the other option as much. But white has queen to c3 here. Everything looks normal, but the position is very tough because black, first of all, is lacking a pawn, which is a pretty big deal on the queen side, but it is also just the piece activity. The queen, white's queen is doing a lot, while black's queen has to find ways to be useful in the game. So black tries to trade these pawns on the queen side, just so that it becomes a bit easier to play. But white finds a really good plan now. She plays b3 with the idea of bishop to b2, which will be really, really strong on this diagonal, which we will see is going to be the idea that wins white the game. Vaishali goes bishop to f5, and now white finds an amazing tactic. You can once again try to get it yourself, but I will show it to you. There's a lot of different ways that white can go on here, but I think she found a really nice one, knight to f6. Now, the point is that if black takes back this knight, we're going to play queen f6, both attacking the rook and threatening bishop to b2 on the next move. But once the bishop gets there, the checkmate is going to be pretty much unavoidable on g7. The queen just doesn't have enough time to get to the defense of the king. So instead, white's pieces are just too strong now. Black doesn't have an option but to just move away the king, and white finds bishop to h6, opening up the king even more. And the problem is, if black takes back, then we have knight to h5 with the checkmate coming up on g7. So in the game, Vaishali goes b takes c5 and knight to h5. Now, there were a lot of different other ways to play for white, but knight h5 just attacks this pawn way too many times, and the black's king position just falls apart. Overall, it was a very beautiful game by Tingjie and a very painful blunder by Vaishali in time trouble, but it was very complicated to figure it all out. But I think we can all agree that it was a very unique game that was almost symmetrical, and we can learn a lot from Tingjie's middle game play and some amazing tactics that this position offered us. The other results of today's round were a draw between the tournament leaders Tang Zhongyi and Alexandra Goryachkina. We also saw a draw between Lagno and Salimova, and yet another draw between Muzichuk and Canero. And with this round, we complete the first round robin of the tournament. So everybody has already played each other once for now. But there will be a second half of the tournament where they play each other the second time with different colors now. So I think it's very exciting that we are entering the second half where everything will get decided. I'm sure we'll see some surprises and some very fighting games from now on. Thank you so much for joining this analysis, and see you next time. Bye bye.